Welcome to Cooper and Cary Have Words. My name is James Cary. I live in England, in the southwest of the UK, in the county of Somerset, and over there in Florida is my friend Barry Cooper. Hello, Barry.
Hello, James. Lovely to be with you in my post-Thanksgiving haze here.
Indeed. And we've just been having a chat with our Patreons a little bit about the weirdness of Thanksgiving and the disparate meal that we Brits see when we look at a Thanksgiving table. But obviously we're missing the point that we should be more thankful to. We're not going to get sidetracked onto that. What are we talking about this week, Barry Cooper?
That would be an ecumenical matter. We are, if you don't get that reference, by the way, you need to look up some clips of Father Ted on YouTube. The ecumenical movement. Now, we're fully aware, aren't we, James, that the word ecumenical may well bring with it the kind of drowsiness that you would expect from a post-Thanksgiving feast. So, can we explain it in terms which make it seem even remotely exciting or relevant to anybody?
Well, let me emphasise the drowsiness that word causes, but also why it's maybe worth thinking about. Ecumenism is the kind of thing that if you were, or maybe still are, young, restless and reformed, it feels like a distraction. It feels like old men, mostly men, in rooms trying to find stuff to agree on. There's the World Council of Churches, I think, isn't there? That's a thing. And if you're an evangelical and you are preoccupied with evangelism and those sorts of things, you're looking at these federations of churches and thinking, what's the point of that? What a waste of time. Yeah. And but there's something, but I think that's more a reflection of an age and stage. He says,
or then again,
age 46.
Yeah, right.
And a member of the Archbishop's Council and the General Synod of the Church of England.
Well, then again, if you're really big on evangelism, you might be thinking, actually, that's precisely why we should all be getting together in rooms and working out how we can just work together, because we all need to be doing evangelism. Wouldn't it be better if, for example, Roman Catholics and Protestants could get together and do it together? Because, hey, we're all talking about the same Jesus, aren't we? So let's pool our resources. Let's, put aside petty squabbles and do this. I think that was probably one of the motivating factors, has been for the ecumenical movement.
I think, talking from the UK at least, I don't know what it's like in America, but I have some sympathy with that view, particularly because although we keep being told that the Church of England is in decline in terms of people turning up, there are an awful lot of Roman Catholics who go to church on a Sunday, and also lots of independent evangelicals, charismatics, Presbyterians. So although the Church of England numbers may be dipping below 1 million, there are probably several million in church on a Sunday morning, and our collective witness would be possibly considerable if we all got it together and spoke with one voice. But of course, that doesn't seem very likely, does it? Because it's a parody, really, of the Christian faith, is that we sort of can't really agree with each other on anything. And maybe Gulliver's Travels was a bit of a parody, at least, when the bit where you have those two tribes going to war over which end to cut your egg. I think that was probably a bit of a sideswipe at religious people who get het up about minor differences. And let's be honest, it is puzzling to look at, because looking from the outside, I, as a evangelical, an Anglican, can say the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, which is extremely long and specific. And it's all stuff that people who don't go to church would not be able to say. They would find it rather baffling and confusing.
He descended into hell. Do you say that bit as well?
Oh, okay. Let's not get into that. That's episode 1, 2, 3. Where did Jesus go when he descended? And he went to preach to the giants in prison, Barry. We all know that.
Yeah, we definitely need to be talking about that.
But it's a very long creed, and if we can all say it, then look, what's the problem?
Yeah, sure.
So what is the problem, Barry?
Well, if we're getting together to preach the gospel and do evangelism, obviously there needs to be some sort of agreement on what the content of that might be. And so that question of how does God reconcile himself to sinful human beings is a big one. It was, of course, the question that precipitated the Reformation. And many would argue that the Roman Catholic Church, if we're just thinking about Roman Catholics and Protestants for a moment, that the Roman Catholic Church is in much the same place as it was 500 years ago, when Luther was, getting very hot under the collar about exactly how it is that a perfectly holy God can be reconciled with sinful human beings like you and I. And if that is the case, and the Roman Catholic Church is still teaching that, then all right, how can we actually get together and thrash out a gospel that we can both agree on in order to do evangelism together? It's interesting. The book which precipitated, I think, us thinking about doing this episode is a really fascinating book called Evangelicalism Divided. It's by Ian Murray, and now I think it's been out a good few years. I'm just going to skim to the front here.
It's not a promising front cover, we'll be honest. It's mostly brown. It's classic Christian publishing, isn't it?
It's mostly brown. There's a Susan of green there. It looks as if a small child has just discovered the word art feature in Microsoft Word.
I thought you were about to say it looks like a very small child has just done something on a piece of card. It's
however you describe that was not meant to be an endorsement, but don't judge book by its cover. It is a really, really, I think both James and I would agree, it's a fascinating book.
Yeah,
and there are lots of name checks for people that will be probably very familiar to people who watch or listen to the show. Billy Graham, John Stott, Martin Lloyd-Jones, these are all big players in this particular book.
J.I. Packer.
Packer's in there. I mean, it's real WWF of sort of modern evangelicalism going on.
But it's the kind of book that lots of probably Christian leaders have read, evangelical Christian leaders. And it's the kind of book that I think most people in the pews, in the cheap seats and all that stuff are looking at, just thinking, I don't want to read that because that's basically a book about church politics.
And it looks like this.
Yeah, and it looks like that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of fair enough, really. So we've read the book so that you don't have to. And this isn't necessarily a book review of that book, but Barry read it and has also written a little bit about it as well. But what is the book trying to do? Yeah,
well, it's the focus is on the ecumenical initiatives in the UK and in the US. On the US side, he talks about Billy Graham and his desire to work with Roman Catholic churchmen during his big crusades. And on the UK side, he focuses in on the kind of spat. I don't think it's being too, on the nose to call it spat, between the two friends, John Stott and Martin Lloyd-Jones, who disagreed very strongly on this whole issue of how much rapprochement should there be between evangelicals and Roman Catholics, and should we even be trying to do so? Are there dangers inherent in trying to do so? And that's what Ian Murray teases out in this book, not just the initiatives themselves and what they involved, but then what the fallout of those initiatives were. And he argues, it's kind of a sad book to read, actually. He argues that it's been extremely damaging for a number of reasons. I think what's interesting initially in the book is where he talks about Billy Graham's obviously doing these big crusades. Roman Catholic officials are seeing the huge crowds that are turning up at the Dodgers Stadium and elsewhere, and they're thinking, well, we're struggling a bit to do evangelism. It'd be lovely if we could get involved here. And so, famously, there were then Roman Catholic churchmen who would be sitting on the platform alongside Billy Graham, very visible when he's there standing up to preach. And I guess the question that Murray poses, or one of the questions he poses, is if you have a ton of people who flood down to the front, as they were wont to do when Billy Graham did his crusades, then the whole question is, all right, which churches do we do we put them into? And of course, the reason that Roman Catholic Churchmen wanted to be involved was because they were hoping that a great number of those people would come to their churches. Now, if you're somebody who believes in the traditional Protestant understanding of the gospel, the one that Luther held to, for example, then it's kind of a little worrying that Billy Graham is getting this huge response from people. They're responding to the gospel, and then they're being siphoned off to churches where they're hearing a different gospel, at least potentially. So the question is that a desirable thing to have done? At what level can we partner, and should we partner, and at what level should we probably not do that if we really care for the effect that doctrine has on people's souls?
There's loads there. One thing that's interesting is I didn't realise quite how, I want to say this in as kind a way as possible, how not fussy Billy Graham was. I'd always assumed that he was a fairly conservative evangelical who was quite specific in the people that he was, as it were, in business with. And actually, he seemed to be, his bar was very low. He had very few purity tests, if any.
Right.
And also the way in which he was happy to ally himself with presidents of the United States and various things that they've done and done wrong. And it's a bit of an inconsistent standard, because I think Graham still has a very high reputation and good name. But another guy like Tony Campolo, who stood with Bill Clinton, who did some, pretty awful things.
Right.
And I was at a gig where Tony Campolo was saying, look, if a guy phones you up and says, I've done this really terrible thing, and you're a pastor, you're his pastor, well, you're not going to put the phone down.
What are you going to do? Yeah, exactly.
So, and you think, that's completely fair enough. So that aspect of the Billy Graham thing, I think, was quite surprising. And with Roman Catholicism.
And of course, the reason that Billy Graham would very clearly argue for the wisdom of doing so, his view was, well, I'll absolutely, as long as you're not dictating to me what I must and mustn't preach, then yes, I will come to your church and preach. I will come to your denomination and preach. I will go to have lunch with this president and spend time with them, because my hope is that if I can preach the gospel to them, what this will result in is a kind of influence for Christ, for the gospel in the world. And funnily enough, we talked about the Hillsong documentary a few episodes ago. Maybe it was just for Patreons, I'm trying to remember. But one of the things that came through that BBC documentary was there was an incredible lust for influence in the world. And obviously Hillsong, Billy Graham, lots of big differences there. But I think one of the things that Murray teases out in the book is that desire for political, social influence, however well motivated it may be, and I don't think he impugns Billy Graham's motives at all, however well intentioned that may be, takes you to a place you do not want to be, because what ends up happening is it's a two-way street. So yes, you may be able to influence a president, but also that president gets to influence you, and those Roman Catholic churchmen get to influence you in ways that perhaps you had not anticipated becoming an issue. And he makes the same allegation actually about John Stott on the other side of the Atlantic, that John Stott badly wanted evangelical distinctives to advance, but he also wanted a renewal of evangelical influence within the major denominations. So he wanted there to be more power for evangelical voices in those other areas which were not evangelical. Lloyd Jones said to him, actually, look, you cannot do those two things at the same time. You can't, if you're trying to gain ecumenical and denominational acceptance, you'll end up paying the price, it's going to imperil the very legitimacy of these distinctive beliefs that you have. You're going to have to water them down in some way. And I think in the book, I think he makes a pretty good case that is indeed, what happened.
Yeah, the Lloyd Jones thing's almost the flip side, isn't it? Because Lloyd Jones was a Billy Graham in one sense, as in he was a massively influential preacher who was obviously, part of a church movement, but he was the one trying to call the establishment out of the establishment to say, look, it's not going to work. And there was a parting of the ways, wasn't there, really? There were some big conferences at the University of Kiel in the 60s, weren't they?
Yeah, that's right.
Which didn't sound a lot of fun, if I'm honest. And, I'm sure there were some great Bible expositions going on, and Lloyd Jones was, by all accounts, a fantastic preacher. But it feels like, in a way, I'd rather have those discussions. It feels to me like everyone is a bit siloed, and that there are probably conversations going on behind closed doors. In fact, I know there are, but actually I would love to have them out in the open, where everybody can sort of listen and think and work out. I don't know why I want that. But it just feels like everyone, it is a bit frustrating, isn't it? And here I am in the Church of England, getting arrows for essentially compromise, and look at what's happening over there in this diocese and that diocese. This bishop's turning a blind eye to that. There's no discipline over here, over there, all those kinds of things. So, and in a way, it feels to me like doctrinal and ecclesiastical purity is pretty easy, by which I mean just leave and start again. But the problem with what happens is that those who did leave and start again, let's talk about Methodism. So how did that go? Which originally wasn't intended to be a schismatic movement. It was originally intended to be, you go to the church, you go to the parish church on Sunday morning, and they don't teach the Bible very well, but that's all right. We'll teach it to you in the afternoon. But it soon
Wesley
became its own
out of
thing.
the Church of England, wasn't he? He was kicked out.
Yeah, sure.
And
but that was kind of the idea.
Yeah, and yes, you're right. I think there has obviously been with Methodism, it's this liberalism has obviously really taken hold there. So yeah, I think that is the way that things tend to tend. But also, I think your point, if I'm hearing you right, is that if you have that instinct, which is, well, these people don't agree with us from A to Z, let's separate. You tend to foster a kind of a way of looking at the world, which means you just endlessly, you kind of separate yourself into oblivion eventually. I think that's a fair point.
Get on a ship and found the greatest nation on earth.
Yeah.
After England, obviously, after the United Kingdom, obviously.
Yeah. And I think we probably do. I have a lot of, I don't know, my sense is that I'm kind of more of that mind than you are, although maybe as I get older, yes, you do. I see people who are extremely intolerant, theologically intolerant of every single, of what you might call adiaphora, things which really don't matter ultimately in a salvation eternal sense. And I just get very frustrated with that. Well, you can't quote A.W. Tozer because he was an Arminian, that sort of thing. And I'm like, well, I don't know.
Well, yeah,
we're going off piste here a bit, but yeah.
Oh, yeah. So there is any theological movement without error? What's interesting is the Westminster Confession has really stood the test of time, and I haven't heard, an awful lot of pushback. And again, that's way, 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 way longer than the Apostles' Creed and incredibly specific. But you can still sign up to that and still disagree with someone over something else. In particular, I guess, the outworkings of those things, because it was a document written in the 1640s. So things are going to kind of look a bit different now. And I think there's part of us which likes to kind of, especially if you're a Calvinist, you like to have a legal framework which takes account of every single possible eventuality, and therefore nothing else needs to be said. And I don't think that's also how God does things. I think there is a progression from Old Testament to New, from early church to more mature church. It kind of feeds back into the postmillennialism we spoke to Steve Jeffrey about.
This is the great thing about
back.
being postmillennial, of course, is that you know that the unity that Jesus talks about and prays to the Father about is coming. So, you believe it's, that's on the way. So I think there's reason for great optimism. And maybe we'll get onto this in a bit, but I'd really like to have a look at Jesus's high priestly prayer, because I think it's very often used as sort of justification for the ecumenical movement. And I'm not sure, I think you think it means something it does not mean. That's what I would say about Jesus' high priestly prayer.
Well, let's get onto that now. I think now is the time.
Now's the time. Yeah, so John chapter 17. Let me just read these verses. Holy Father, keep them in your name. He's talking about, in the first sense, the disciples immediately with him, which you have given me, that they may be one, even as we are one, i.e. the Father and the Son. I do not ask for these only. He's about to pray for you, James Cary, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. So that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you've given me, I've given to them, that they may be one, even as we are one. I in them and you in me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and love them even as you love me. So, all right, I've got two comments on this, perhaps provocatively. See what you think, right?
Strap in, everyone. Coops tells it like it is.
Hitting the ripcord. Here we go. So a friend of ours has pointed out, rightly, I think, that there are two kinds of unity. One is the kind that we already have by virtue of being Christian and are required simply to preserve and maintain. So an example of that, I'm thinking of Euodia and Syntyche in the Philippian church. Paul's appeal to them is, look, you're already in Christ. Stop squabbling. We need to preserve that sort of unity in the local church. That's one sort of unity. The other kind of unity, there are only two, is one that we are not supposed to have yet. So when Jesus prays that they may become perfectly one, he's not saying, hey guys, you're all a bit squabbly, you Roman Catholics over here, you Protestants over here, you need to get with the ecumenical project because it's making me look bad. Can you please just start agreeing with each other? He's saying, God the Father will do this. You don't do this. God the Father does this. Will do it. It's future tense. So the picture is of the day, I think Ephesians chapter 4, verse 13, the day when we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Well, when do we have that fullness of Christ? We attain to that. That is the last day. That's the day when we see the Lord face to face. We are perfectly known and we perfectly know. And therefore, because we all have perfect knowledge, we have unity. Because unity is grounded in truth. The reason we have disunity now is because none of us have the monopoly on truth. We all think imperfectly about things. We don't have all the truth. I disagree with you. You disagree with the guy over there. Why? Because we're all, we don't see perfectly. We don't understand perfectly. And therefore we have disagreements about doctrine. But on the day when we see things perfectly, all the impediments to unity are removed. And wonderfully, we become one. And yes, there's going to be lots of surprising people there who may be, oh, you're from the wrong denomination. Well, how on earth did you get in? And there'll be lots of people we're expecting to be there from our own circles who presumably won't be.
This is the elect, right?
Right, quite.
And there'll be some there who will go, oh, that's weird. I don't actually believe in the elect.
That's right. Well, except they will, because they'll go, he says pompously, Calvinistically, because they'll see perfectly and they'll go, oh, I was wrong all that time.
Oh, I should have been a Calvinist the whole time.
Yeah. Oh, you got that bit right. Okay.
And the Calvinist is going, oh, wait till you hear what I got wrong.
Yeah, exactly. There's going to be Credo Baptists like me there going, oh, I can't believe it. Peter Baptists were right all along, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But that's a future thing. That's future tense. in my view, that is a sort of unity that we are not supposed to be. We cannot manufacture that, is my point. So I don't think that we should therefore feel this awful burden based on our reading of this chapter of John to sort of be joining hands and singing Kumbaya with Roman Catholics who,
and if you can't join hands and sing Kumbaya with Catholics, well, what's wrong with you?
You're not a proper Christian, as TV sitcoms have taught us.
Do you hate them?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And that's right. And no, and so the answer to that is no, of course not. I mean, and there are lots of things I would partner with my Roman Catholic brothers and sisters on. I mean, we had one of our Patreons talking about there's a prayer meeting that they have in their village. There's Roman Catholics there, there's Protestants there. I think on one level, I could see being a part of that. There are other things you might want to join hands with. For example, where it comes to things like sanctity of life, dignity of human beings, and so on. Absolutely, there's lots of partnerships there.
And here's a surprising one. The Catholics make use of the Alpha course.
Right. Well, there's a whole can of worms there. That's fun.
There are at least 2 cans of worms that you can open at either end. I mean, so you can get four lids off that one.
That's right. Worms everywhere.
Worms everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, yes, I think that's true. But just to finish my thought on that, there are some things where evangelism, I guess, would be one of them. If we can't agree on what is the content of the evangel, we're going to be pushed to do evangelism together. Much as I may love my Roman Catholic brother and sister.
I mean, it's one of my frustrations, though, that when we talk about what the evangel is, a lot of it is an element of preference about which bits we think are important.
That's fair enough, yeah.
There are a number of folks who I've heard get very frustrated with Church of England bishops, that when the Church of England bishops talk about mission and evangelism, there's lots of, except we're not agreed on what the gospel is. And I'm going to ask them what the gospel is. And if it doesn't match basically 2 ways to live, or my favourite
verse. It couldn't possibly be that my version of the gospel is incredibly anemic.
If they don't pick 1 Peter 3:18 or whatever it is, for Christ died for sins once for all, the righteous and unrighteous to bring you to God, then they don't understand the gospel. It's like, so that's quite a common thing, which I find frustrating. But there was another thing I was going to say, and I've unfortunately forgotten it. Oh, yes, I know what it is. Wouldn't it be great if there was just one great big monolithic church? Hey, wouldn't that be good? And what that would mean is you'd have a mega church in every city, because mega churches are brilliant, aren't they?
They're good, aren't they? We should have more of those.
I can't think of any recent examples of mega churches going badly. Let's have more of them. And not only mega churches, but let's have mega denominations, which are where flawed human beings wield extremely large amounts of power and money. It's like,
and again,
I think I'm making my point.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that ties back to what I was saying earlier about, I think the sort of preservation of unity that we ought to be focusing on is at a local church level, rather than huge sprawling denominations trying to enforce from above a kind of quote unquote unity. And yes, I'm using scare quotes quite deliberately.
I mean, we haven't even used the word Catholicity yet, but I don't think we're going to go down that. I think maybe a klaxon will go off if I use it again, so I won't mention it again.
The Apostles' Creed, the Catholicity of the Church. I mean, what do we mean by that?
The other thing I wonder is, again, there is a neatness and maybe a 20th centuryness about centralisation. We love everything to be centralised.
Oh, like the EU, you mean?
By which I mean, I'm sort of also thinking global Marxism and those sorts of movements as well.
Yeah.
Where there's that kind of everything would just be ordered and better if there was one organisation.
There is a school of thought that says that the ecumenical movement is basically the result of modernism. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And which is sort of, we need to bring it all together and have committees and subcommittees and zones and regions and and I
Unify.
think a tiny example of that, though, is when I remember, I think I went to some prayer meeting in Parliament or visited, and discovered that there were 3 or 4 different prayer meetings running in Parliament. And they weren't actually specifically along party lines, but there was a group of 15 or 20 MPs who prayed together. And then on another day, at another time, a different bunch of MPs. And again, part of you thinks, well, wouldn't it be better if there were 3 groups of 20, you all got together and 60 of you prayed? To which the answer is, well, do you know what? If you did that and you said, right, we're going to scrap 3 meetings and have one, suddenly attendance is 35. 25 people either can't make the meeting or know that if they don't turn up, no one's going to miss them.
Or because there's 60 people all trying to do a prayer, it's going to go on for about 4 days.
Yeah.
Don't fancy
that talking over thing as well. MPs are quite good at talking, so you'd have
Right.
lots of that. People start a prayer at the same time and then go, no, you go. No, you go.
After you.
It would be even more embarrassing in Westminster than the rest of England, which obviously that would be. So I think, again, small units are, and I'm a kind of an anti-centralised guy. I'm a small state guy. So I like the small units. And a church, it's a healthy church that's somewhere between, 20 and 180 people, maybe 200, 300. But at that point, it's like, well, why don't you start another church somewhere else, nearer where half of your congregation live?
Yeah.
And then,
quite.
So I think it feels like there is some wisdom in just keeping everything small. And in one sense,
I find that so interesting, and I think I understand the logic, but it's really interesting that somebody who really believes in the Anglican project, if I can call it that, has that sort of view, which I would agree with, that I think the smaller units are better. I know I'm just flagging it up. I'm not saying it's an inconsistency. I'm just saying it's a really interesting.
No, I think it's important, and I think that's what I like about it. And that's what I've realised that we need to lean into, because it is, I might have called it on this podcast before, the Church of England is anti-fragile, because every single parish in England is a separate legal institution.
Yes.
And it's governed to some extent.
It's functionally independent congregational.
It's governed by the diocese. So the bishop is theoretically the minister's boss, but the bishop can't really tell you what to do too much. There's quite a lot of leeway.
Yes.
And the archbishops of Canterbury and York can't really get the bishops to do stuff they don't particularly want to do.
Yeah.
So you have this really complex system of overlapping institutions. And I think from people from the outside, they get really frustrated that there's impurity here and difficulty there and anomalies here and there and there and there. But at the same time, there's also really good stuff going on that is actually quite well protected because it's legally, it's separate.
Yeah.
So
and to say on that, so much depends on the metaphor, doesn't it? It's really interesting. So people think of, look at this ship, and it's got all these separate little compartments. Wouldn't it be better if we just knocked the walls through and everybody was all together? No, those compartments are there so that if you get holed before, below the waterline. Yeah. Like, do you know what I mean? It's like there's two ways of looking at it. And I think very often the multiplicity of denominations or groups within denominations is seen as a necessarily negative thing, when actually it's, as you say, it's anti-fragile. That is what enables the immune system to work. Yeah, I would argue. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that desire to centralise and have one thing, the Church of England is one thing to some extent, but it's also it's common worship and it's 39 articles, but it's not really it's not the Archbishop of Canterbury isn't the CEO who can just shut down the whole of the South West Division. Right, we're pulling out of Somerset and Devon and Cornwall, because the Diocese of Truro, Exeter and Bath and Wells would go, no. So even if, for financial reasons, one would wish to join a diocese together, because, the dioceses have changed over the last 1,000 years, as you would expect, not as much as you might think.
But if you wanted to do that, that's going to be a really difficult, you'd need acts of parliament to do that kind of stuff. So anyway, so in a way, that's kind of what John Stott was probably hanging on to when Martin Lloyd-Jones was saying, drop it, bin it, can it, it's not going to work. I think it's sort of two different views, really.
And yet, I think there was a lot of similarity there, because Lloyd-Jones would be the guy to say, well, let's have this sort of more of an independent sort of approach. And what I've heard you say, and I'm sure the reality of Anglicanism is, having been in it myself for so long, is that it is a sort of almost a loose agglomeration of effectively independent churches. It's not that much difference, really. I mean, the label we put on it is very different. But, clearly, if Anglicanism were, what is perceived to be a bug in the polity, I think is actually a feature in that sense. It's what keeps it going. That ability for different congregations to do things very differently and not to get, chucked out.
What's the similarity or difference with the Southern Baptist Convention? I mean, because the Southern Baptist Convention it's a label, it's a badge, it's a brand, it's a denomination. But to what extent is it similar or different?
Well, it's kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? Because what you've got there is this kind of right, you guys, everybody be like super independent, keep being independent-y, great. Now everybody's got to get together and have like we're all one big happy family. Well, hang on, I thought you said we were independent. Like, how does that work? So it seems like there's a fundamental tension in there, and I don't think that very independent churches should pretend that they are. There are certain things you can partner with, but I don't think you should pretend that you've got all the hallmarks of a big denomination where you're sort of like Presbyterianism or Anglicanism, because surely that was the one thing you were trying to escape. So, I don't really understand that, to be quite frank. Somebody who's more conversant with the SBC could probably speak much more intelligently into that. But
so, in a sense, it is primarily a congregationalist movement, is it? But it's an element it's a bit like the FIEC in the UK, which is Federation of Independent Evangelical Churches. Exactly. There's an element of collective wisdom, governance, not really oversight.
Share our resources. But there's certainly not oversight. And so that's where my question mark about the SBC is. It's like, well, when you pass a resolution at the SBC, what does that really mean? How do you enforce it? I thought the whole point was that, you're independent. But anyway,
Southern Baptist listeners, send us an email, coopercary@gmail.com, and tell us that we're just way off.
You guys don't know what you're talking about. I know. And here we are, episode 122. Who's laughing now? We should probably round this off fairly soon, but should we land on Calvin? Yeah, and also maybe I'm glad you brought Calvin up, because one of his main points is something I didn't get to talk about when we were talking about John chapter 17, is he basically says, if I'm understanding him right, there's no unity without truth. So in John 17, all of that stuff that I read earlier, there's two, right in the middle of all of that, there's two verses which are really, really significant, where Jesus says, he says, sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. And let me find the other bit. Yeah,
that was the motto of my school.
There you go. It's a good one.
Your word is
verse
truth.
17. And verse 19, for their sake I consecrate myself, that they also may be sanctified in truth. So all of the talk of unity in that high priestly prayer, the understanding is that comes about because of the truth. And again, it's probably a truism to say it. I don't want to belabor the point, because it's been made by Calvin and others rather more eloquently than this particular chimp. But but how are we going to have any sort of unity? It has to be unity in the truth. Otherwise, it's not unity at all. Now, we can obviously then have a big, long conversation about, all right, well, which bits of the truth are kind of really super non-negotiable and which aren't. But ultimately, it is the truth which grounds us. And if we have significant differences, like, for example, that maybe we think that God is not actually triune, well, we're not going to have, it seems to be, much unity, except only in a very shallow sense. So if we lose sight of the truth as the ground of our unity, then we start making unity king rather than truth king. And if you want to be united at all costs, yeah, absolutely, go ahead, knock yourselves out. But what have you really achieved? You've now got unity, but in order to preach what truth? And the reality is that often you have to sacrifice it. So I have to be careful here as I'm saying this. I don't really want to get people into trouble, but my own tiny little personal experience of this was a Seventh-day Adventist church invited a group of us to go preach there. We said, absolutely, if you'll let us preach and we don't have to compromise anything or water down anything we're saying, we'll go. What happened in practice was, in the preaching, because we were aware that the guy who invited us was a big donor for the organisation, so there was a certain amount of tacit pressure there. Lovely guy, by the way, totally delightful, lovely guy. But very subtly, we played down and in fact then just left out of a talk any reference to God's wrath and eternal torment in hell, because we knew the Seventh-day Adventists are annihilationists.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So, yeah, fun fact. So there was just a subtle pressure that came about there. We wanted to be, join hands, be united. Yes, let's, we can, there's so much that we agree on here. And yet the one thing that actually, one of the things we disagreed on, there was a tendency to, it's never the liberals that become more conservative in doctrinal belief. It's always the conservatives that become more liberal when you join hands like this. And that's what happened in my experience. We left it out, and to our shame.
Yeah. Although having said that, some say that John Stott was an annihilationist.
Indeed, towards the end of his life, that was his position. And that's right. But it was not the position of, even though we came from his church, that was not the position of any of us when we went.
Yeah. And that in itself is a little tale of, oh, that's it then, cancel Stott. He's gone soft
on
the gospel. And it's at this point, it's the eternal inquisition. It's the Stalinist church, Stalinist show trials, isn't it?
Purge.
And where does it end?
Yeah. But again, we're responsible. If you believe that this doctrine is true, you can't pretend that it isn't true for the sake of unity.
Yeah. But also, lots of things presuppose that disagreement is embarrassing, unthinkable, and wrong when we're given plenty of evidence that, in Acts alone, of just, proper stand-up rows over issues in public. But also within Paul's writings, some of you consider one day holy and others don't. And, bear each other in mind. He's
absolutely.
not saying, he's not knocking heads together.
No.
It feels like what's called a pastoral accommodation is built in to...
That's absolutely right. And at the same time, of course, he's also saying, I am astonished that you have abandoned the gospel, that, I wish they go the whole hog and emasculate themselves. Do you know what I mean? That's not very ecumenical, is it, Paul? Come on. So yes, it's holding those two things and deciding.
That would not be an ecumenical matter.
That would not be. Paul, come on.
Paul.
Yeah. That's terrible, wasn't it? It might be time for an Enya jingle round about now.
Definitely.
Definitely. But anyway, that's all. I rode your hobby horse there. I rode my own hobby horse as you raised it. I will stop doing that now. Get off and step away from the horse. Oh, the stuff about truth. Blah, 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 yada, yada, truth, capital T, blah, blah, blah.
But in a way, there's no point in having unity if it's not based on truth. That's just unity. Exactly.
I think so.
So that's not what the church is about. It is gathered around Christ. And I guess the last headline really, as I was thinking about this, is if we're not careful, we still have a very man-centered view of what the church is and what it's for. And forgetting that it is the bride of Christ, the people of God. We are going to be the ones before the throne. The fact that we can't get on now, it should be no great surprise to anyone. And therefore, wouldn't it be great if we got on better? Yes. Will that always be possible? No. Is that the end of the world? No. The end of the world is the end of the world. That's the profound insight.
It's a literal,
yeah. And it's easy to forget that, you know...
the eschaton. It's not the end of the world, is it?
Well, as I was thinking about this from a different angle, and I've been sent some books from the Davenant Institute, so I sort of sent out an SOS to Rhys Laverty, who we had in this podcast recently, and I'll mention his books Institute. More in the future. But as I was reading some of these books about the history of all of this stuff, and the history of sort of Catholicity and everything, it's very easy for us to think, again, if you're the product of British conservative evangelicalism, you might think the church is there so that I get good teaching and then go to heaven. The church is the kind of the mouthpiece, the method, the disciplinary board that keeps me on the straight and narrow so that I get to the celestial city. There's no real church in Pilgrim's Progress, is there? There's the Pope, not a hero of Pilgrim's Progress.
Right.
Pope, a.k.a. Antichrist, I think.
Right. He really nailed his colours to the mast there, as indeed he does throughout the book.
And therefore, my continual dislike of Pilgrim's Progress for its literalism, but also the fact that this is a journey we all take alone. You become a Christian, you get yourself to the eternal city, the celestial city. And he occasionally hangs out with a guy called Faithful. But there's no one called church, and there's no group of people down the road called Coffee Rota. And there's no... So I think maybe that incredibly successful book is part of a bigger piece, which is we're still fundamentally individualists. And therefore we think I should be able to have a denomination to choose that is in my image.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I'm not one of those people. I'm one of these people. I prefer
the
this
classic
to that.
Roman Catholic criticism of the Reformation.
Yeah.
Another little dig there. You never miss an opportunity, Mr. Cary, to have a little dig at our friend John Bunyan. James Cary, John Bunyan. Let me just the sort of celestial wine and cheese party. The first night's going to be great. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. I think his own personal story is probably more interesting. I'll be much keener to hear about that. Tell us about how you wrote the book in prison. Let me tell you about the book. No. Tell me about how you wrote it. That's much more interesting.
Don't do that. I've read your book. It's fine.
Yeah.
You don't need to. Yeah.
But he in itself is a product of church discipline and state-church overlap, overreach, banned from preaching, kept preaching, put in prison. So he's not had a good experience of the church. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised at that.
He's certainly not had a good experience of the sort of church-state alliance. Yes.
And that's one for another podcast.
That would be for another episode. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Once again, if you would like more of this, and frankly, why wouldn't you? We've got a Patreon scheme. No, not Patreon scheme. That makes it sound like a Ponzi scheme, doesn't it? It's a lovely little club, is what it is. It's a nice, soft, furry club. Go to cooperandcary.com and click on the Patreon link at the bottom right, and that will get you all sorts of goodies, which are currently going up on the screen if you're watching. If they're not, then just click on the link in the show notes of the podcast, and you'll be able to see all the lovely things that you two can enjoy. Extended audio and video, and access to the exclusive Discord server, and lots of other wonderful stuff. Are there any other ways that people can get in touch with us, James, if they want to?
They can. cooperandcary@gmail.com, Facebook, and Twitter. Nobody bothers with Facebook for us. But Twitter...
Or Twitter, really.
Twitter's Instagram, we have been known to Instagram occasionally.
Right, yeah.
But I have to say, the best way is actually Patreon. So do join us there. usually
James and I are on the Discord server all the time, so we really have lots of one-to-one and one-to-group sort of chats with each other, and it's great. Yeah.
And it's kind of what you'd hoped that Facebook was going to be like, but wasn't.
Yeah.
So do join us there. But send us an email, cooperandcary@gmail.com, because we'll do a mailbag episode soon. We should probably start delving in the mailbag.
We really should.
And
because Christmas is coming up, isn't it? And the decks are already going up in the Cooper household. I know that's probably a horrendous thought to you, James, but they are. And Mariah Carey was even played on Spotify the other night.
Too soon.
I could almost hear you saying it when it happened.
Yeah.
And I'm inclined to agree, but there it is. We haven't had Wham's Last Christmas yet, though, so all hope is not lost.
For me, it's Christmas Wrapping by the Waitresses. That's the one that always gets me.
That's right. That's your
favourite
one.
That's my favourite one. And I quite like Paul McCartney's one, Simply Having a Wonderful Christmas Time. I like
that one. Lots of sleigh bells on that one.
Yeah.
So yes, thank you for joining us, and God willing, we will speak to you again in 2 weeks' time. Cheery, bye.
Bye-bye.
Cooper and Tea have words.